Welcome to the Code Navigators, your guide for, well, navigating the pretty complex world of the International Code Council codebooks.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Our mission here is really straightforward. We want to walk you through the core of each chapter, explain what's in there, and, maybe most importantly, help you master the navigation you need for those ICC exams.
That's exactly right. And I think the big thing to remember is that it's not just about memorizing numbers. Understanding the system, the intent behind the rules, is how you really pass those tests.
Right, it's about knowing where to find the answer and why the answer is what it is.
Exactly.
So before we jump in, a quick note on how we put this all together. This is created with AI-assisted generation, but, and this is the important part, it has meticulous production and oversight from a human code professional.
Yeah, we use the tech to help synthesize, but a licensed expert checks everything for accuracy and, real-world context.
And that context brings us to something we absolutely have to cover first.
The legal statement.
Please listen closely to this part. Everything we discuss today is for educational purposes only. It is not professional advice.
We can't stress that enough. We're here to help you study, not to sign off on your project. You must always consult the official current code.
And you have to contact a qualified professional or your local code official for any specific project or question.
Definitely. And one more thing in our discussion, we won't be stating any copyrighted material directly from the codebook.
Okay, with that very necessary part out of the way, let's get into it. Today, we're tackling a big one. International Building Code, Chapter 14, Exterior Walls.
The building's primary shield. This chapter is huge because it covers literally everything on the outside of the building. We're talking materials, fire resistance, how to install it, windows, doors, trim.
It's all in there. And if you're studying, you should see two big themes right away. Fire and water.
How well the wall performs against fire and how well it performs against weather. And it's where those two things interact that this chapter gets really dense.
Okay, so let's start where the code does, with the general performance rules in Section 1402. Section 14.2 basically lays down the law.
It does. It says every exterior wall has to provide weather protection, period. It has to be designed to stop water from getting inside the wall assembly.
And that leads right into the star of the show, the WRB.
The water resistive barrier, yeah. The WRB is the code's main tool for this. It's your backup plan. You're cladding your brick or siding is the raincoat. But the WRB is what keeps you dry when the raincoat leaks.
But it's not just about rain, right? It's also about moisture from the inside.
Right. And that's where you get into Section 1404.3. It says you have to protect against condensation. So you need a vapor retarder system. The wall has to breathe correctly.
Yeah. It's a two-way street for moisture management.
Exactly. Now, what I think is really interesting is how the code handles new stuffed materials and systems that aren't already in the book.
Oh, yeah, the performance testing. Section 1402.2 is pretty tough on new products.
It's non-negotiable. If you invent some new kind of wall panner, you have to prove it works. You have to put it through some really rigorous testing.
So what does that testing look like? What are they trying to find?
They're trying to find the weak points. They simulate wind-driven rain, and they force you to test the assembly at 3 key spots where walls almost always fail.
Okay, what are...
You have to test at least one opening, so think a window or a door. You have to test one control joint or wall sleeve interface. And you have to test one wall sill.
That makes perfect sense. That's where all the water gets in.
It's where all the problems happen in the real world. And they don't just sprinkle it with water. The test has to run for a minimum of 2 hours.
2 hours straight? Why so long?
It's to simulate a really bad storm. Not just a quick shower, but a sustained heavy thunderstorm or like coastal winds that are just driving water into every little crack and crevice for hours.
Okay, so they're really trying to make it fail.
They are. They apply a pressure of about 6.24 pounds per square foot, which is like a 50-mile-an-hour wind pushing that rain against the wall.
And what if it does leak? Is any amount of water okay?
A tiny bit. And this is interesting. Section 1402.2.3 says you can't have more than 1 pint of water leakage per square foot of the wall area during that 2-hour test.
1 pint? That's not a lot.
No, the code knows perfection is hard, but it demands functional robustness. It's why you can trust modern systems like EIFS or panelized walls. They've survived this trial by water.
Okay, so we've covered water. Let's pivot back to fire safety. Section 1402.4 is basically just a reminder that you still have to follow all the rules from Chapter 7 for fire resistance ratings.
Right, it's a cross-reference.
Yeah.
But then Section 1402.5 brings up a really specific fire risk.
Oh, cool.
What if your WRB itself can burn?
Which it usually can, right? It's often paper or plastic.
Exactly. So this becomes a huge deal on bigger buildings. If you're on a Type 2, 3, or 4 construction, so non-combustible or heavy timber buildings, and your wall is more than 40 feet above the ground.
There's that 40-foot number. Why 40 feet? What's the significance of that height?
Well, 40 feet is a pretty common threshold in the IBC. It's often seen as the practical limit for fire department ladders and aerial access. Above that height, fighting a fire from the outside becomes much, much harder.
So a fire spreading up the outside of the building is a much bigger
A
problem.
much bigger risk. And a combustible WRB hidden behind the cladding can act like a fuse, just carrying the fire straight up the building where firefighters can't get to it.
So if you're building above 40 feet, how do you handle a combustible WRB?
The code gives you two ways out, two exceptions in Section 1402.5. Exception 1 is all about limiting the fuel.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means the WRB has to be the only combustible thing in that part of the wall, and it has to be behind something non-combustible like brick or stone. And the WRB itself can barely burn. It has to have a peak heat release rate under 150 kilowatts per square meter.
Which is very, very low.
Tiny. It basically means it just won't contribute much heat to a fire. Now, the second exception is usually easier for manufacturers to meet.
And what's that one?
Exception 2 is about surface burning. It just says the WRB material has to have a flame spread index of 25 or less and a smoke developed index of 450 or less.
Ah, the classic Class A fire rating. We see that everywhere.
Right. It's the standard test from ASTM E84 or UL 723. The logic is, if the flame can't travel quickly across the surface of the WRB, it's much less likely to spread fire vertically up the wall cavity.
So you either limit the fuel or you limit the speed. The code just wants you to pick one.
Exactly. One way or another, you have to address that vertical fire spread risk on taller buildings.
All right, that brings us to Section 1403, where we get into the nuts and bolts of the materials themselves.
And Section 1403.3 is pure exam fodder. It's basically a reference library. It tells you exactly which standard like ANSI or ASTM your specific material has to comply with.
So this is where the IBC points to other organizations and says, their standard is our rule.
That's a perfect way to put it. For example, if you're using hardboard siding, it has to meet ANSI A135.6. If you're using aluminum, it has to meet AMA 1402.
And some of the really common ones today, like fiber cement siding.
That has to meet ASTM C1186. And even newer stuff like polypropylene siding has its own standard, ASTM D7254. If you see one of those standard numbers on an exam, your brain should immediately go to Chapter 14.
Okay, let's circle back to the WRB for a second, but this time on its physical construction from Section 1403.2.
Okay, so the code is pretty simple here. It says the WRB must be at least one layer of an approved material.
Just one layer.
At least one. But how you install it is critical. It has to be continuous, and it has to be applied in a shingle-lap manner.
Meaning top over bottom, so water runs down and out.
Exactly. You're using gravity to help you.
Yeah.
And the material itself has to be up to snuff, meeting standards like ASTM E22556 or the old school ASTM D226 for asphalt felt.
All right, let's dive into what you called the ultimate prescriptive section, Table 1404.2, minimum thickness of weather coverings.
Yes. You do not want to be guessing these on a test. You either know them or you know exactly where to flip to find them.
Let's run through a few just to see the logic. For example, natural stone has to be a minimum of 2.0 inches thick. That seems pretty substantial.
It is. And that 2-inch thickness is about structural integrity. Stone is heavy, it's brittle, and it needs that mass to resist impacts and to be tied back to the structure safely.
Okay, now contrast that with something like aluminum siding.
A huge difference. Aluminum siding only has to be 0.019 inch thick.
That's paper thin.
It is. The code is recognizing that aluminum is just a decorative skin. It's not providing any structural value. It's just there to shed water and look good. Its support comes entirely from the wall behind it.
What about something in between, like exterior plywood?
If you're using it as a covering over sheathing, it has to be at least 0.313 inch thick, or 5/16.
Yeah.
And for vinyl siding, another common one, the minimum is 0.035 inch.
And the one I always remember is stucco. For a standard 3-coat system, it's gotta be
0.75 inch thick. 3/4 of an inch. That depth is what gives it strength and helps it resist cracking over time. If you understand why the number is what it is, it's a lot easier to remember.
Totally agree. It connects the rule back to the real world. Okay, so that's the outside shield. Now let's talk about the inside shield. Vapor control. in section 1404.3.
This is where things get really complex, and it's all about climate. The goal of a vapor retarder is to stop water vapor from the inside of the building from getting into the wall cavity and hitting its dew point.
Because if it hits a dew point, it turns into liquid water, and then you get mold, rot, all kinds of bad stuff.
All the bad stuff. So the code breaks down vapor retarders into 3 classes based on how much vapor they let through, which is measured in perms. Understanding these classes is fundamental.
Okay, let's go through them. Class 1 is the most restrictive, right?
Right. Class 1 retarders are basically vapor barriers. They have a perm rating of 0.1 or less. Think plastic sheeting or foil-faced insulation. They stop almost all vapor movement.
Then you have Class 2.
Class 2 is more of a vapor retarder. Its perm rating is between 0.1 and 1.0. The classic example is the craft paper facing on fiberglass batt insulation. It slows vapor down, but doesn't stop it completely.
And finally, Class 3.
Class 3 is the most breathable, with a perm rating from 1.0 up to 10. And the easiest example of this is just standard latex paint on drywall. It offers some resistance, but not a lot.
Now, the key here is you don't just get to pick whichever one you want.
Not at all. Section 1404.3.1 sends you directly to table 1404.3.3 to A2SC, and your choice is dictated entirely by your project's climate zone.
This is where the building science really kicks in. So, for example, in a hot, humid climate like Miami Climate Zone 1, you generally don't want a Class 1 vapor barrier on the inside. Why not?
Because in that climate, the moisture drive is from the hot, humid outside to the cool, air-conditioned inside.
Yeah.
If you put a plastic sheet on the inside of your studs, that outdoor moisture will travel through the wall, hit that cool plastic sheet, and condense.
And now the water is trapped inside your wall.
Exactly. The wall can't dry to the inside, and you just created a perfect environment for mold. So in those climates, the code wants the wall to be able to breathe.
But in a very cold climate, like Minnesota Zone 6 or 7, it's the complete opposite, right?
The complete opposite. The moisture drive is from the warm, humid interior to the cold, dry exterior. So there, you do want a Class 1 or Class 2 retarder on the inside to stop that interior moisture from getting into the cold wall cavity where it will definitely condense.
Okay, but then there's a huge exception to this, and it involves continuous insulation.
Yes, the CI exception, which you'll find in Table 1404.333. This has totally changed how we design walls. If you add a layer of continuous insulation on the outside of your sheathing, the rules for the inside vapor retarder can relax a lot.
Why is that? How does insulating the outside change what happens on the inside?
By wrapping the building in an insulating blanket, you keep the structural sheathing warm. So even in a cold climate, the sheathing itself never gets cold enough to hit the dew point.
Ah, so the surface that the vapor would condense on is no longer cold.
Exactly. It stays above the dew point. So the interior moisture can pass through a more breathable Class 3 retarder, like paint, and it won't condense into liquid water because there's no cold surface for it to condense on.
So let's use that Zone 7 example. Normally, you'd need a Class 1 or 2 barrier.
Right. But if you have a 2x4 wall and you add at least R7.5 of continuous insulation on the exterior, the code says you're now allowed to use just a Class 3 retarder on the interior.
It's just paint.
Just paint. That R7.5 of CI is doing all the heavy lifting to keep the wall safe from condensation. It's a perfect example of how the code is really performance-based under the surface.
That's a great point. Okay, so that sets us up to talk about the actual installation details, starting with flashing in section 1404.4.
Yes, flashing is probably the single most important detail for making a wall last. The code mandates it at every week, point heads and sills of windows, where a wall meets a roof, any penetration.
And the key isn't just that it's there, but how it's installed.
Exactly. The flashing has to be installed to kick water out. It's an exit ramp. Any water that gets behind the cladding has to be directed back to the exterior.
The perfect example being weep holes in a brick wall.
The classic example. The flashing above a window in a brick wall will catch the water, but the weep holes are what let that water actually drain out. Without them, you just have a little bathtub sitting inside your wall.
Okay, now let's get into some of the specialized claddings, starting with anchored masonry veneer in section 1405.1. This is your traditional brick face.
Right. It's tied back to the structure, but it's not actually holding the building up. And the code puts a pretty firm height limit on it for certain building types.
What's the limit?
On a type 1, 2, 3, or 4 building, anchored veneer is limited to 40 feet in height.
There's that 40-foot number again. Why the limit on brick?
It's mostly about seismic and wind loads.
Yeah.
Above 40 feet, the forces acting on that heavy but non-structural layer of brick get much higher. There's a greater risk of the ties failing and the veneer peeling off the building during an earthquake or hurricane.
And the code is especially cautious on those more rigid, non-combustible building types.
Right. The attachment itself is also super specific, requiring corrosion-resistant ties. And you absolutely must have that airspace, usually at least 1 inch between the brick and the backing.
For drainage and drying.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Without that gap, the entire drainage system fails.
Okay, so how is that different from adhered masonry veneer in section 1405.3? This is like the thin-cut stone you see everywhere now.
The key difference is that it's glued on, not tied on. So the primary control in the code is weight. The whole system can't weigh more than 40 pounds per square foot.
And there's an even lower limit in some cases, right?
Yes. If you're going over a wood frame structure, you're limited to only 20 pounds per square foot because the wood sheathing just can't handle the stress of having that much dead load glued directly to it.
So for adhered veneer, it's all about making sure the bond is strong enough to hold the weight.
Exactly. It's all about substrate prep, scratch coats, metal lath, and proper curing.
Okay, let's talk about something a little more unusual. Glass veneer in section 1405.11.
The code is very, very cautious with glass on the outside of a building, for obvious reasons.
Right. If it breaks, it's a huge hazard. So the thickness is limited to less than a ½ inch.
And you can't just cover a whole building with it. The total area is limited to no more than 10% of the exterior wall surface. Plus, you have to have shelf angles or metal supports at certain intervals to carry the weight.
So there's redundancy built in. If one piece fails or the adhesive fails, the shelf angle is there to catch it.
That's the idea. The code assumes failure is possible and designs for it.
Okay, let's wrap this section with vinyl and polypropylene siding.
Sections 1405.14 and 1405.18. For both, the code mainly points you to the ASTM standards. But there's one key installation requirement for both.
And what's that?
The code requires a calculation to determine the fastener spacing.
You actually have to calculate it.
Well, a designer does. You have to base the nail or screw spacing on the specific wind loads for that building. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The goal is to stop the siding from ripping off the wall in a high wind event.
Another great example of performance-based requirements hidden in the prescriptive code.
That's what it's all about.
All right, let's move into what can be a really challenging area. Fire safety for these complex systems, starting with the limits on combustible materials in section 1405.1.
This is a huge one. This section tells you how much wood or vinyl siding you can put on a non-combustible building like a steel-framed office building. And it all comes down to fire separation distance.
So how close you are to your property line.
Exactly. And the magic number is 5 feet. If your fire separation distance is 5 feet or less, you are seriously restricted.
How restricted are we talking?
You can't have more than 10% of your wall area covered in a combustible material.
Only 10%. So if you're building right up on the lot line, your building has to be almost entirely brick or metal or something that won't burn.
That's the intent. Now, if you're more than 5 feet away, the rule changes. It's no longer a simple percentage.
What does it become then?
It becomes about radiant heat. The code has a table 1405.1.1.2 that sets a tolerable heat level.
What on earth is a tolerable heat level?
It's a measure of how much heat your combustible siding is allowed to give off if it catches fire. The further away you are from the property line, the more heat your siding is allowed to generate because there's less risk of it setting your neighbor's building on fire.
So it's all about protecting the adjacent properties.
Absolutely. It's a community fire safety rule baked right into the exterior wall chapter.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about metal composite materials, or MCMs, in section 1406. These are the sleek metal panels you see on a lot of modern buildings.
Right, and they're a big concern for fire because they usually have a plastic core between two thin aluminum skins.
So the fire performance is critical.
Critical. The surface has to have a flame spread of 75 or less, but the real issue is the core. If the core is combustible, section 1406.4 says you need a thermal barrier. Which means what, exactly?
It means you have to have at least a ½ inch of gypsum wallboard separating that combustible core from the inside of the building. And this is where we get to the most important fire test for modern facades.
The NFPA 285 test.
The NFPA 285, this is the big one. If you're putting MCM with a combustible core on a type 1, 2, 3, or 4 building, the entire wall assembly has to pass this test.
So can you explain what the NFPA 285 test is? How is it different from the regular flame spread test?
The standard flame spread test, ASTM E84, is a small-scale test. They take a little sample of the material and see how fast fire runs across the surface in a tunnel. It's limited.
Okay.
NFPA 285 is a full-scale wall assembly test. They build a 2-story section of the actual wall cladding, WRB, insulation, studs, window, everything. Then they light a fire in a room on the first floor and have it break out the window.
So it's simulating a real-world fire, a real-world scenario, and they watch to see if the fire spreads up the outside of the building. If the flames jump vertically or spread too far laterally, the assembly fails. It's a test of the system, not just one material.
And we see that same test requirement for EIFS, right? Exterior insulation and finish systems.
We do. Section 1407 requires EIFS on Type 1 through 4 buildings to pass the NFPA 285 test as well, for the exact same reason. You have to prove the system won't create a vertical chimney for fire.
Now, EIFS also has a big water management component, doesn't it? Based on some historical issues.
Yes, based on major historical issues. The code now, in Section 1407.4.1, talks specifically about EIFS with drainage. This is now a requirement in many places.
It has to be really effective at draining.
Extremely effective. The system has to have a minimum drainage efficiency of 90%. That means if 10 drops of water get behind the finish coat, at least 9 of them have to drain right back out.
So they're not relying on a perfect seal anymore. They're assuming it will leak and designing a way for it to dry.
That's modern building science in a nutshell. Assume failure and manage it.
Okay, a couple more to cover. What about high-pressure decorative laminates, or HPL, in Section 1408?
Another modern panel. And because it's combustible, the code limits its use. On a Type 5 building, you can only install it up to 40 feet in height.
The 40-foot rule again?
It's a consistent ceiling for combustible claddings. And if that HPL system contains any foam plastic insulation, the code immediately sends you over to Chapter 26.
Which is the big chapter on plastic.
Right. And it has its own, much more stringent rules for fire protection and thermal barriers. The code is very good at making those cross-references when you introduce a hazardous material.
Okay, and finally, a quick mention of plastic composite decking in Section 1409.
This one is simple. It just says, if you're using plastic composite for decking, stairs, or railings, you have to follow the rules in Chapter 26.
So again, Chapter 14 handles the wall, but Chapter 26 handles the specific plastic material.
It's a great example of how the chapters all work together as a network.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up and summarize. It feels like the two huge takeaways from Chapter 14 are performance against water and performance against fire.
I think that's right. We covered the core performance, like that 2-hour water leakage test, and we went through the key prescriptive tables, like 1404.2 for material thickness.
And we really dug into the vapor retarder classes and how your choice is completely driven by your climate zone and your insulation strategy.
And then on the fire side, we emphasized that NFPA 285 test for complex claddings like MCM and EIFS. For exam purposes, knowing where to find those tables, 1404.2 for thickness and the 1404.3 tables for vapor retarders, is absolutely key.
So I want to leave you with a final thought on all this, something that connects these technical rules back to the real world.
Okay.
Think about that builder in a cold climate making a decision based on the vapor retarder tables. The choice of whether to spend the money on that R7.5 layer of continuous insulation is what determines if they can use simple, breathable paint on the inside, or if they have to use an impermeable plastic sheet. That single decision, based on one number in one table, is the difference between a wall that can manage moisture and last for decades, and a wall that traps condensation, grows mold, and causes sick building syndrome just a few years down the line.
That's so true.
The complexity in Chapter 14 isn't just for show, it's about long-term durability and ultimately about the health of the people inside.
That decision on vapor control really is the hidden engine of a durable wall. It's everything.
So if you appreciate this level of detail and how we break down these chapters and you want to support us making more of this content, you can find a link to our Patreon in the show description.
Your support really does help us keep the Code Navigators going.
Until next time, keep digging into the code.
And keep connecting the what to the why.
Keep learning. We'll talk to you soon.